What happens when the greatest success of your life is actually your greatest prison? Hollywood doesn't sell love, it sells an image. And when two women, icons of an industry that dictates who you're supposed to be, discover a spark behind the scenes that was never part of the script, they have only two choices: stay in line or shatter the glass. This is not a story about what the media reports. It's about what they whisper when the lights go out, when the cameras stop rolling, and the weight of fame forces them to hide the very thing that makes them human. Prepare yourself to uncover the secret no one was ever allowed to film, a world where the most forbidden touch is the one you can barely conceal. Fictitious story. Look, I need to take a quick pause here. If you've been following this channel, you know that every story I bring is a piece of who I am. Writing these Sapphic stories and giving a voice to feelings so many of us keep hidden is my life's mission. But we all know that, on this platform, there are limits. The rules are strict, and many times the very things I most want to create, the emotional depth, the tension, the vulnerability, and the intensity that truly touch the soul, have to be softened to protect the future of this channel. I refuse to let our stories be told only halfway. That's why I've opened the doors to a private world of my own, an exclusive stories collection, a library of stories and audiobooks reserved for those who truly understand the value of this project. There, the narrative is free. The emotions, the longing, the humanity, the love, and the passion can unfold with the creative freedom I've always wanted to explore, but simply can't risk exploring here. By gaining access to this collection, you're not just enjoying unforgettable stories and immersing yourself in deeply emotional romances, you're becoming part of the foundation that keeps this channel alive. The truth is that your direct support is the only reason I can continue writing, editing, and bringing new content to you week after week. It's a community built on connection, passion, and mutual support. If you feel these stories deserve to be experienced without limitations, with all the depth they were meant to have, and if you'd like to help protect and sustain this space we've created together, you'll find the link pinned in the first comment. Come join me in this inner circle. It's an honor to have you walking beside me on this journey. Now, take a deep breath with me, because the scene you're about to experience is one you'll never forget. The hum of the air conditioner in that Los Angeles trailer seemed louder than it should. Julianne adjusted the satin dress strap, her fingers trembling slightly as the mirror returned an image she barely recognized. The makeup was heavy, the lips painted a cold red, almost ceremonial. She heard knocks on the door, dry and hurried, before the doorknob turned. When Clara entered carrying a folder of schedules and the distinctive smell of black coffee with rain, the mood shifted. There was no immediate greeting, only the sound of Clara's heels stopping on the wooden floor, exactly 1 meter away. Julianne did not turn. She watched Clara's reflection in the mirror, the way she pinned her hair into a rushed bun, the forehead slightly sweaty. "You are 10 minutes late," Julianne said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. Clara exhaled, the kind of sigh that didn't seek excuses, only acceptance. The traffic on the 405 was jammed, an accident near Santa Monica. "The set is chaos, Julianne. They've been looking for you for 15 minutes. You know the producer doesn't like waiting." Julianne finally turned. The eye contact hit, something she didn't expect to have to deal with before breakfast. Clara did not flinch, though the intensity in the other woman's gaze was enough to disarm anyone. "The producer doesn't like many things," Julianne answered, standing up slowly. The movement of the satin fabric against the chair produced a noise that filled the silence for a second that was too long. She walked to Clara, stopping at the boundary of the personal space. Clara stepped back a pace instinctively, but her eyes remained fixed on Julianne's. "What happened to your neck?" Clara asked, changing the subject, her voice dropping a notch. She reached out, stopping a few millimeters from Julianne's skin, but did not touch. The air between them seemed denser, charged with static. Nothing, just the mark of the jewelry, or the pressure. "I can't tell them apart anymore. Do you have the new script?" Clara hesitated, holding the folder against her chest more tightly. "Yes, but I don't think you'll like the changes they asked for the ballroom scene. They want you to look more distant." Julianne laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Distant. As if I could be anything other than that in this place." She stepped forward again, invading Clara's space in a way that forced the other to back against the trailer wall. The noise outside, Voices shouting instructions, assistants running. Everything seemed to have dissipated, becoming a background hum of no importance. Clara breathed in deeply, the chest rising and falling in a way that Julianne followed, hypnotized by the lack of control that suggested. "They don't understand," Clara whispered, in a thread of voice that seemed to be for the two of them alone. "They think the audience wants perfection, but they're afraid of what is real. And you are very real, Julianne, even trying to hide behind that mask." Julianne felt her chin tremble. The urge to touch Clara's face was an electrical current, unbearable and silent. She leaned in, just enough to smell Clara's perfume, a blend of old paper and something sweet, perhaps vanilla. "Maybe they're right to fear," Julianne answered, her voice almost a whisper. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was inevitable. Clara lowered her head, staring at her own shoe, her hands still gripping the folder so tightly that the knuckles were white. She knew that moment was dangerous. The set was an aquarium, watched by dozens of eyes, cameras, and schedules. Any wrong move would mean the end. "I have to go," Clara said, though she hadn't moved an inch. The hesitation in her voice betrayed her real intention. She wanted Julianne to stop her from leaving. She wanted to have a reason, no matter how small, to stay there, in that suffocating trailer, ignoring the producer's orders and the clock that ran mercilessly. Julianne watched Clara's throat move as she swallowed hard. She wanted to say stay, but the weight of fame, the contract, the expectations of the outside world, was a lump in her throat she couldn't untangle. She simply stepped back, reclaiming the space she had just invaded, letting reality seep back through the partly open door. If you enjoy stories that explore the human fragility behind the big lights and want to follow this unfolding, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we will discover, step by step, how far this tension can go before breaking. Clara walked toward the door, but before leaving, she stopped and looked over her shoulder. Julianne was still there, standing, with her right hand touching the place where the diamond necklace, heavy and cold, rested against her collarbone. Neither of them said anything else. It wasn't necessary. The silence inside already told the whole story. Clara opened the door, letting the bright artificial studio light invade the trailer, dissolving the intimacy of the previous moment as if it had never existed. Julianne was left alone again, surrounded by oppressive silence, while the sound of footsteps faded down the corridor on set. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, trying to keep the calm the industry demanded, but the tremor in her hands wouldn't stop. The filming set looked like a living organism, breathing through the constant buzz of the generators and the frenetic ebb and flow of the crew. Julianne walked among the spotlights, her face sculpted by artificial lighting that turned her into someone else, someone who did not suffer, someone who did not tremble when touched by another's shadow. She hated that feeling of being watched, of having every inch of her skin analyzed by lenses that did not capture what lay beneath the surface. Clara, on the other hand, moved through the corners, the tablet clutched in her hands like a shield. She did not look at the cameras. She looked at Julianne, and Julianne knew that. She felt the weight of Clara's gaze on her back, a physical pressure that kept her from relaxing her shoulders. The makeup artist came close to retouch the lipstick, and Julianne closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of powder, fixer, and fatigue. "Stay still," ordered the makeup artist, a pragmatic woman who barely looked her in the eyes. Julianne obeyed, feeling herself as an object, a wax doll that had to be perfect for the lens waiting out there. Clara approached the control monitor, her brow knitted in a fine line that Julianne knew well. She was jotting something down frenetically. The surrounding noise, the director's shouts, the metallic sound of cables being dragged. Everything seemed to disappear when Clara positioned herself beside Julianne's chair. "The director wants the scene repeated," Clara said without looking up, her voice maintaining a professional, cold tone that hurt more than an argument. "She says the expression is too contained. He wants you to show more." Julianne opened her eyes, staring at Clara's reflection on the black monitor. "Demonstrate more of what, Clara?" she asked, her voice too low to be heard by anyone more than a few inches away. "The pain? The joy? Or just what they want me to pretend?" Clara finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, tired, but there was something there she tried, unsuccessfully, to hide behind the routine's rigidity. "You know it isn't about what they want," Clara answered, pausing, the static pen in her hand. It's about what you let slip. And you're letting too much slip today. Julianne rose from the chair, ignoring the makeup artist's request to wait. The long satin dress dragged along the dusty floor, a bizarre contrast with the luxury of the character she played. She walked to a more secluded space, behind one of the studio's large columns, a place where the light died and the shadow ruled. Clara followed, a faithful shadow that this time did not seem to keep a safe distance. "I can't just switch off," Julianne whispered, her back against the cold concrete wall. "Every time you enter the room, every time you hand me these papers, I feel like I'm losing control. Do they want the perfect actress? Fine, I'll give them perfection. But you're asking me to be human. And here, in this place, being human is a strategic mistake." Clara stepped forward. The space between them narrowed, the air thinning. She looked to the sides, checking if anyone was watching. Paranoia was the only constant. "Nobody's watching," Clara said, though her hand trembled slightly as it touched the sleeve of Julianne's dress, adjusting a loose thread. "They're all worried about framing. No one cares about what happens behind the scenes." Julianne felt the touch, a minimal, almost non-existent pressure that seemed to travel down her spine. "You're lying to yourself," Julianne retorted, staring into Clara's trembling lips. "You know they can tell. They sense everything. They don't hire people to be real. They hire people to be silent. Silence is our bargaining chip. If you keep looking at me like that, if you keep treating me as if there's something here..." Clara cut the sentence off with a brusque, almost violent motion, stepping back as if she'd been shocked. "I never said anything," Clara asserted, her voice rising a notch, exposing the nervousness. "I do my job. I manage your schedule, your interviews, your contracts. If you feel anything, that's your problem, Julianne. I have nothing to do with it." She was trying to convince herself, trying to put the mask back in place, but her shoulders were stiff, her fingers gripping the tablet so hard that the joints turned white. Julianne watched the attempt to flee. It was pitiful, it was cruel, and it was the most real thing that had happened on that set, all day. The director yelled from the center of the stage, "Julianne, we're ready. Where are you?" The sound echoed, breaking the tension bubble, bringing reality back with a cutting sharpness. Clara spun on her heels, the expression returning to automatic mode, her face transformed into a mask of efficiency. She didn't look back. She didn't wait for a response. She simply began to walk toward the lights, the light bursting onto her face as she moved away, turning her into a silhouette against the intense glow of the spotlights. Julianne remained there, in the shadows, feeling her chest rise and fall unevenly. She needed to breathe, needed to regain balance, but Clara's scent, that strange mix of coffee and paper, still hung there, stubborn, refusing to disappear. She clenched her fists, trying to contain the urge to chase, to grab Clara's arm and ask, for the 1,000th time, what they were doing with each other's lives. But she didn't. She adjusted the dress, lifted her chin, and walked toward the light. The scene demanded that she cry. The script called for a precise tear, which would slide down the left side of her face at the exact moment the camera focused on her eyes. Julianne positioned herself. She looked at the lens, and then, for a fraction of a second, looked at the monitor where Clara was sitting, with her back to her. The image on the monitor showed what no one else saw. Clara was still, facing nothing, with her left hand squeezing her own wrist, a red mark on the skin betraying the effort to keep still. Julianne felt a lump in her throat. It didn't require technique, didn't require forced emotional memory. The tear fell, real and warm, burning the skin before following the planned path. "Cut!" yelled the director, enthusiastic. "Perfect. Exactly what we wanted. You saw that? Her delivery is absolute." Julianne didn't hear the praise. She could only see the way Clara relaxed her hand, almost imperceptibly, when the scene ended, as if, deep down, she was also crying, but in a way that no one, besides Julianne, would ever be able to identify. Leaving the stage, Julianne passed Clara. They didn't speak. There was no exchange of looks, nor a smile, nor a deliberate brush. But as she passed, Clara dropped a pen, a simple black pen that rolled across the wooden floor. Julianne stopped, crouched, and picked it up. The metal was warm from prolonged contact with Clara's hand. She could have left it on the table, could have drawn Clara's attention and returned it. Instead, Julianne tucked it into the pocket of her costume jacket. feeling the heavy object against her thigh. It was a small theft, a secret, a piece of Clara's routine that now belonged to her, a connection, however small, that she could carry with her as she faced the rest of that endless day. Clara paused for a second, feeling the emptiness in her hand, but did not look back. She knew exactly where the pen was, and that knowing, the silent complicity, was enough to keep her moving forward, even as her legs felt like they were made of lead. Night fell over the studio, turning the artificial lights into tiny stars inside a huge, cold warehouse. The filming ran past the scheduled time, which was common, but that night, the air seemed to have changed its density. The physical fatigue was evident, not just in Julianne, but in everyone on set, including Clara, who oscillated between checking the schedule on the tablet and watching the city lights through the small studio watch window. Julianne sat on one of the high stools at the set bar, pretending to drink the stage beverage, a cold tea that tasted like cardboard, while waiting for the next instruction. The director was on the other side, discussing the angle of the next shot with the camera operator. Clara was nearby, just a few meters away, adjusting the lighting. She seemed oblivious to the rest, but Julianne could see how her eyes wandered, almost magnetically, toward her. The attraction was a gravity of its own, an invisible force that kept them orbiting one another, even when they desperately tried to maintain the regulatory distances. "You're exhausted," Clara's voice came, low, from behind, almost like a whisper that Julianne wasn't sure she heard or imagined. Julianne did not turn. She simply watched Clara's reflection on the opposite wall, a frosted glass that distorted the image, making everything softer. "Exhaustion is part of the contract, Clara. You know that better than anyone." Julianne turned her face just enough to see Clara's profile, the taut jawline, the way she held her breath before speaking. "It doesn't have to be like this," Clara answered. "Could be simpler. We could just work like normal people." Julianne laughed, a dry sound, with no trace of joy. "Us? Normal? Clara, look where we are. Look at what we do. Nothing here is normal. What we have—" She stopped, the word have hanging in the air like a threat. "What we have is a well-told lie, and we're getting very good at it, aren't we?" The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of a tech adjusting a light pedestal. It was a loaded, dense silence, the kind that precedes a storm no one dares admit is coming. The cold wind that blew through the Burbank studios carried the metallic smell of iron and the lingering exhaust from a full day of recording. Julianne walked through the empty parking lot, the sound of her steps echoing between the empty trailers. The California night's silence was, ironically, louder than the set's confusion. She stopped near her car, the yellow glow of a streetlight casting her long, distorted shadow on the ground. Clara was there, leaning on the hood of a dark sedan, hands tucked into her coat pockets, posture tense, as if waiting for something she feared would happen. When Julianne approached, the air between them seemed to vibrate, an invisible static preventing casual closeness. They did not speak immediately. The distant highway was the only accompaniment to the discomfort in the air. "You forgot this," Clara said, taking her hand from her pocket and extending the object. It was the next day's script, with marks made in pen, but what it really offered was an excuse, a broken bridge that they both pretended was solid. Julianne took the paper, feeling Clara's fingertips brush the palm of her hand. It was a quick, accidental touch, but it made the air go out of her lungs. She stepped back quickly, the instinct to defend herself kicking in before thought could process the longing. "I already copied the notes," Julianne murmured, her voice unfiltered by the usual acting. Clara stepped back, facing her own reflection in the car's dark glass, avoiding direct eye contact. "I didn't know. I thought that—" She stopped, the sentence dying in the air like smoke. "I thought you would need it. It's a hard scene, the one where the character must choose between career and what she feels." Julianne gave a bitter laugh, which echoed dryly in the empty parking lot. "Irony, isn't it? Life imitating art, or at least trying. Do you think anyone inside really believes the character will choose love? They want her to end up alone, victorious, but hollow. That's the ending they sell. That's the ending they approve." Clara stepped a little closer, invading Julianne's space without asking permission. The proximity was a risk, an invitation to disaster, but neither of them seemed able to retreat. Clara's face was lit by the weak glow of the streetlight, highlighting the tense line of her jaw and the damp gleam in her eyes. Maybe the character doesn't need to do what they want, Clara whispered, almost to herself. Maybe she could simply decide that the cost isn't worth it. But that takes courage, doesn't it? It requires that you're willing to lose everything you've built for something that… She didn't finish. It didn't need to. The word love was too dangerous to say aloud. There, exposed to security cameras and the secrets those studio walls kept. Julianne felt her jaw tremble. The desire to touch Clara's face, to smooth that hair that always seemed a little out of place, was a silent torture. She stayed rigid, arms crossed against the cold, trying to anchor herself in reality. "And you, Clara?" Julianne asked, her voice taking on a challenging tone, loaded with a vulnerability she hated showing. "Would you tell her to throw it all away? Would you risk your reputation, your job, your place in this industry, for a moment of… truth?" The silence that followed was filled only by the distant hum of generators. Clara looked down, at her own shoes, trying to hide the intensity in her eyes. She didn't answer. The lack of an answer was a confession. She couldn't say yes, and saying no would be the greatest lie of her life. Julianne felt a twinge of frustration mixed with an unbearable tenderness. She wanted to force Clara to speak, wanted her to break, to confess that the fear they both shared was what kept them together, and at the same time, on opposite sides of an impossible abyss. "You're trembling," Clara noted, her voice changing tone, becoming softer, more human, devoid of the professional veneer she wore during the day. She stepped forward again, this time without hesitation, and extended her hand, gripping Julianne's arm just above the elbow. The contact was firm, warm through the thin layer of Julianne's coat. Julianne did not pull away. She simply closed her eyes, absorbing the sensation, the warmth of Clara's skin, the pressure of that grip. "It's just the cold," Julianne lied, though she knew Clara knew it was a lie. "This city is very cold at night." Clara smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It isn't the cold, Julianne. You know it isn't. You're afraid, and I am too. And that's why we're here, standing in this parking lot, pretending we don't want exactly what the script forbids." A car rolled by the side street, its headlights sweeping the parking lot and forcing them to loosen their grip abruptly, as if they had committed a crime. Reality, cold and merciless, returned to settle between them. The moment of vulnerability, which had seemed eternal, was broken by the need to survive. Julianne adjusted her coat, her heartbeat racing, an erratic beat that betrayed the internal agitation she was trying to hide. "We can't," Clara whispered, her voice heavy with a resignation that hurt. "They're watching everything, all the time. There's no room for us here. There's no space between what they demand and what we feel." She stepped back, moving away, the distance increasing with every second, making the chasm between them more real. Julianne felt a sudden emptiness where Clara's hand had been moments before, a physical absence that felt like a cut. "Tomorrow," Julianne said, the words spilling out before she could control them. "Tomorrow we have that scene in the cafe, the goodbye scene." Clara stopped, her body paralyzed, her back to Julianne. She didn't turn around. She stayed there, motionless, under the yellow light of the street lamp, a silhouette that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Yes," Clara answered, her voice choked. "The goodbye scene." She began walking toward her car, not looking back, not offering a farewell beyond that professional formality that killed them slowly. Julianne watched her leave. Clara's car engine started, the exhaust sound cutting through the night's quiet. She watched the taillights recede, shrinking until they disappeared into the darkness of the road. Julianne got into her own car, but she didn't start the engine. She stayed there, sitting in the driver's seat, hands resting on the steering wheel, smelling Clara's scent, that mix of coffee and paper, which seemed to have ingrained itself in her clothes, in her skin, in the air around her. The script Clara had given her was on the passenger seat, the pen marks still fresh. She reached out and touched the page, where Clara had written a note in the margin, with hurried and almost illegible handwriting. "Don't apologize for feeling." Julianne exhaled the breath she had been holding, a long, tremulous sigh that dissolved into the car's quiet. What would she feel when the camera turned on tomorrow? What would happen when she had to perform a farewell, knowing that in real life, they did not even have the freedom to begin? The doubt wasn't whether the script would be followed, but whether they could keep pretending in front of so many lenses. that they weren't each other's only truth. The director's shout of cut sounded like a guillotine, dry and final, severing the heavy atmosphere that filled the set. Julianne, still standing in the center of the studio, felt cold sweat trickling down the back of her neck. The tungsten lights, relentless and hot, seemed to suck the oxygen from around her. The scene was a goodbye. The script asked her to look toward the horizon, with glazed eyes, and accept that the person she loved was leaving forever. But at the moment, she should have turned and walked into the light. Her eyes did not find the horizon. They found Clara. Clara, who was backstage, leaning against the lighting grid, with the tablet against her chest, and her face submerged in a shadow she did not bother to avoid. Julianne could not fake it. The tear that streamed down was not technique. It was a waste of time the director didn't need. But for her, it was the only truth possible that day. "Julianne, please." The director's voice came from far away, filled with a contained impatience. "We need you to loosen up. The scene asks you to relinquish it, as if there were nothing else. Right now, it seems you're holding on to something that doesn't exist." The line struck Julianne's chest like a stone. Holding on to something that doesn't exist. She looked again at Clara, who barely breathed, Clara's pale hands grasping the equipment. The set's silence was deafening. Julianne felt the tip of her fingers tingle. It was an exhaustion that didn't come from sleepless nights, but from the constant performance of being someone who didn't feel what she felt. She wanted to scream that the scene wasn't wrong, that the scene was the only true thing in that entire studio. But the words got stuck, scratching her throat. She walked to the corner, where the shadows were thicker, ignoring the assistants who tried to adjust her costume. Clara was there, eyes fixed on the floor, trying to become invisible. "Did you see?" Julianne whispered, the voice barely audible but charged with an electricity that made the air vibrate. "They say I'm not believing in the farewell. How can I believe in something I can't even pronounce?" Clara didn't move. Her shoulders were tense, rigid, as if she were holding up the ceiling of the studio. "You need to do your job, Julianne," she answered, not looking up. The sound of Clara's voice was sharp, polished, too professional to be real. "They pay for an interpretation, not for a confession. If you keep leaving that door open, they'll notice. And when they notice, they won't just ask for another take." Julianne approached. She didn't touch Clara, but the proximity was an invasion of privacy that left them exposed. Clara's perfume, that smell of coffee and old paper that now seemed to have infiltrated Julianne's pores, surrounded her. "And what if I didn't care?" Julianne asked, a whispered challenge. "If I didn't care about what they'll notice, what would happen if I just stopped pretending?" The silence that Clara imposed was worse than any answer. She lifted her gaze finally, and what Julianne saw there wasn't rage, nor fear. It was deep exhaustion, a weariness of someone fighting a war they know they're going to lose. "You would lose everything," Clara answered, voice choked. "And I would lose you. And they would win, Julianne. They always win because they feel nothing. We feel, and that's what makes us targets." The sense of weariness was palpable. It was as if the skin were too thin, susceptible to any cut. Julianne felt her knees tremble, a weakness she couldn't control. She leaned on the concrete wall, feeling the cold texture against her shoulder, seeking a balance point that didn't exist in that world of projected fantasies. Sometimes love becomes a test of survival. It's about holding someone's hand when the whole world demands that you let go, and discovering that even without any guarantee of staying, the risk is the only thing that makes us feel truly alive. If you know what it's like to live on that edge, where every gesture is a bet and every word a secret, perhaps this space is yours too. Enrolling here is only an invitation to follow how far this story can go, before reality finally reaches what we try to hide. Clara stepped back, creating a necessary distance, a front line she tried to keep between them. "We have 3 more scenes today," she said, voice returning to the technical tone as if reading a grocery list. "The Bailey scene, the discussion in the hallway, and the closing. You need to focus, adjust your posture, breathe." She was trying to fix her, as if Julianne were a broken piece of equipment that needed repair before the next take. Julianne watched Clara's hand movements, the way she smooths the skirt, repeatedly, the nervous tick that gave away that her coldness was a farce. "You're trembling, Clara," Julianne pointed out, noting her hand by the side swaying involuntarily. Clara looked at her own hand, as if seeing it for the first time, and quickly tucked it in her coat pocket. "It's just the air conditioning," she lied. "They always leave this place too cold. Come on, they're waiting." Without waiting for a reaction, Clara turned and walked toward the center of the set. Her steps were firm, decisive, but there was a mismatch in rhythm, a hesitation that Julianne couldn't help but notice. She followed Clara, feeling every centimeter of fabric of her dress brushing against the skin, as if everything were inflamed. The set, which had seemed a workplace, now became a minefield. Every look, every whisper among the crew, every camera click, seemed like an accusation. They were living a lie that was getting too big to be contained. Upon reaching the center, the director pointed to Julianne's place. "Let's go. Scene 5, take 4. Julianne, I need less expectation in your look. You're portraying a woman who was abandoned, not one who is hoping for a return." The director laughed, a nasal, graceless laugh. "Real life isn't a romance. People leave, Julianne. They don't look back. Apenas essate adore et continue." Julianne breathed deeply, closing her eyes for a second. The pain wasn't the problem. The problem was the hope that stubbornly existed, even when everything around shouted that it shouldn't. She positioned herself, feeling the weight of Clara's gaze on her back. She knew, without needing to look, that Clara was there, holding the script, holding her breath, holding the desire to be anywhere but there, watching that scene. Julianne began the scene. She didn't act. She simply existed. She let real fatigue, real frustration, and real fear mix with the character. She didn't look toward the horizon. She looked at nothing, at the emptiness she knew would come if Clara stepped away. And when the director yelled cut again, there were no applause. There was absolute silence, a silence that weighed, suffocated, shouted what no one had the courage to say. Julianne felt a tear roll down, not for the character, but for herself. Clara approached, but not to give instructions. She stopped beside Julianne, and for the first time, there was no tablet, no script, no producer's mask between them. There were only two people, exhausted, trapped in a lie-filled setting, living a truth that threatened to destroy everything they had built so far. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing more to say. The hotel in West Hollywood seemed too quiet that early hour, an emptiness reverberating in walls lined with expensive fabric. Julianne sat at the edge of the bed, staring at a fixed spot on the carpet, while the tapping of light rain against the double-glazed window was the only thing keeping her connected to the world outside. When the door opened, the metallic click of the magnetic card being an unwanted announcement, she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Clara entered with a heavy step, the coat still damp from the night's humidity, carrying a leather folder that looked heavier than any document she'd ever carried before. She didn't switch on the main light, preferring the amber glow of the bedside lamp. "They decided," Clara said, the voice without any inflection, as if reading a footnote, "the public relations team. Starting Monday, I'll be relocated to the production unit in New York." Julianne felt her stomach lurch, a sudden chill climbing up her spine and freezing her throat. She finally raised her gaze, watching Clara, who remained at a calculated distance, hands griping the bag's strap, the knuckles white. "New York?" Julianne repeated, the city's name sounding strange, distant, almost impossible. "Why now? The shoot isn't even finished. We still have weeks of external scenes here." Clara shrugged, a contained, almost expressionless movement. "The logistics have changed. They need someone trustworthy to supervise the pre-production of the next project. And apparently I am the most qualified for that." She looked out the window, avoiding eye contact, the jaw clenched in a hard line, admitting that every word there was torture. "It's for the best, Julianne. You know, things were becoming too exposed." The logic of those words was a blunt knife. Julianne rose slowly, feeling the weight of her own body as if she had aged a decade in the last few minutes. She walked to the center of the room, stopping a few centimeters from Clara. The smell of rain and cold coffee emanated from her coat, an aroma that, for months, had been her safe harbor, and now, suddenly, was becoming the warning of a departure. "Exposed what, Clara?" Julianne whispered, her voice coming out faltering, a thread of sound that barely filled the space. "The fact that I can't breathe when you're in the room, or the fact that you can't either?" Clara closed her eyes for a moment, and Julianne saw a solitary tear trace a quick path across her face, quickly wiped away before it could be noticed. It doesn't matter what we feel. It matters what they see, and they saw enough. That moment on the set, the hesitation. They have editors, Julianne. They have security. They have people paid just to notice where we're looking. Julianne wanted to scream, wanted to grab Clara's arm and stop her from leaving, but Clara's rigidity was an impassable barrier. She was closed off, protected by layers of professionalism and fear, an armor that Julianne had no right to remove. "So this is it?" Julianne asked, feeling a pang of anger mix with the pain. "You're just going to turn away? Go away because they think we're a risk to their profit?" Clara let out a sigh, a tremulous sound she tried to control. "It's not about their profit. It's about what will be left of us if we continue. If I stay, if we keep going like this, they'll destroy everything. They will destroy your career. They will destroy what remains of my reputation. They don't care about us, Julianne. They care about the image, and we are not a good image for what they want to sell." Silence returned to reign in the room, heavy and oppressive. Julianne looked at the bedside table, where a glass of water rested untouched. She approached Clara, extending a hand to touch her arm, but hesitated, keeping her fingers suspended in the air, afraid to break the barrier. "I don't know how to do this," Julianne said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to wake up tomorrow and know that you won't be there with the schedule folder. I don't know how to pretend I don't miss you." She did not finish the sentence. It wasn't necessary. "I don't know either," Clara answered, finally meeting her gaze. Her eyes, usually so controlled, were brimming, a storm contained by a dam ready to give way. "But I have to know. I have to learn, because the alternative is worse." Julianne lowered her hand, feeling the emptiness of the surroundings. She sat again on the bed, the place seeming immense, a desert of white sheets. Clara remained standing. The contrast between her static posture and the internal chaos they both shared was almost unbearable. "When are you going?" Julianne asked, breathless. "Tomorrow morning. The flight leaves at 6, Clara answered. She stepped forward, as if to say more, but stopped. The hesitation was obvious, the conflict between duty and desire shouting in her behavior. She ran a hand along the sleeve of her overcoat, a nervous habit Julianne knew all too well, a sign that she was trying to stay whole. "I shouldn't have come here today," Clara murmured to herself. "I should have just left the note in the script." "But you came," Julianne retorted, a spark of hope, however small, arising from the darkness of that night. Clara looked toward the door, then at Julianne. The inner struggle was visible in the subtle tremor of her hands. "I needed to," she began, but the words died. She stepped closer, an instinctive, almost unconscious movement. The space between them narrowed, the air thinning, charged with an electricity that wasn't about what was being said, but about what was being contained. "I needed to see if you were okay." Julianne laughed, a dry sound, with no trace of joy. "I'm not. You know I'm not." Clara nodded, a slow, almost painful motion. "I'm not either." It was the most honest confession the two had made in months. There were no more masks, no more schedule, no concern with the cameras. Just two people, exhausted and terrified, facing the end of something that had barely had a chance to begin. Clara turned to leave, but at the door, she stopped. She didn't look back. The hallway light lit only her profile, highlighting the sadness she carried on her shoulders. "They win, Julianne. They always win. But they can't take what happened inside here." She opened the door, the hinge sound sounding like a sentence. Julianne remained on the bed, watching Clara's silhouette disappear down the hotel's lit hallway. She didn't run after her. She didn't ask her to stay. She knew it was useless. She knew that, in that world, distance was the only form of protection they had. The silence that remained in the room was no longer the same. It was a silence heavy with absence, an echo of everything they would never have the courage to say. Julianne closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, the scent of coffee and rain still hovering in the air, a persistent memory of what she was losing. The night outside continued to rain, the constant sound serving as a metronome for her loneliness. She knew that when the sun rose, life would go on. The set would be there, the director would shout orders, and she would have to pretend. But at that moment, in the dark of the room, the only thing that mattered was the emptiness Clara left, a hole in the chest that no career or fame in the world could fill. The air in New York had a different density, a cold that seemed to want to enter through the pores, even with all the apartment windows closed. Clara sat on the floor of the living room, leaning back against the sofa, watching the snow begin to fall, dotting the glass with white, irregular shapes. The promotion, which should have been the peak of her career, seemed only like a luxurious exile. Life in Manhattan was fast, full of meetings, deadlines, and voices, talking about numbers and projections, but at the end of the day, the silence of her apartment was deafening. She looked at the cell phone resting on the coffee table, the screen dark as an empty mirror. For weeks, she tried to convince herself that distance was the solution, that time would erase the attraction, that work would consume the space Julianne occupied in her thoughts. But as the days passed, Julianne's absence did not diminish. She became a constant presence, a ghost that inhabited every coffee she drank and every corner she crossed in the city. In Los Angeles, the feeling was of an eternal and claustrophobic spring. Julianne was in her dressing room, surrounded by mirrors that reflected not her image, but that of a stranger. Success continued to flow, awards, interviews, flashes that blinded, but she felt as if she were living in a film without a script, where her lines were imposed and her movements choreographed. She held a pearl necklace, her fingers gliding over the smooth surface, feeling the coolness of the object, which was as distant as the life she led. The phone rang, a sharp sound that cut through the room's quiet. She did not need to look at the caller ID. Her heart, treacherous and persistent, sped up immediately. When she answered, Clara's voice, on the other end of the line, came a bit muffled, as if crossing an ocean of regrets. "I couldn't sleep," Clara said bluntly, the voice devoid of the efficient producer cloak she used to wear. Julianne pressed her forehead to the cold mirror, closing her eyes. The contact with Clara's voice, even through technology, brought a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "I didn't either," Julianne replied, her voice coming out in a trembling whisper. "The house is empty, Clara. Even with all the people who pass through here, even with all the noise Hollywood makes, it's empty." On the other end, Clara's silence was filled with a noticeable breath, an effort not to crumble. Distance had not healed anything. It had only sharpened the longing, more vivid, more urgent, impossible to ignore. "They're forcing me to accept a new project here," Clara continued, her voice choked. "They want me to stay for another year. They say I'm the best, that I have a bright future at this branch." She paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. "But every time they offer me a raise, every time they praise me, I can only think about how I would trade all of this for 10 minutes in that trailer in Los Angeles, for anything that was real, for any silence that wasn't loaded with fear." Julianne felt a tear slip, tracing a hot path down her face. She wasn't acting anymore. There were no cameras, no audience, no producers monitoring every breath. For the first time in months, she could simply be Julianne. "You don't have to stay," Julianne said, her voice gaining a firmness she didn't know she possessed. "And I don't have to be the actress they want me to be." She looked at the script on the dresser, the page full of markings about how she should be, how she should act, how she should love. Suddenly, the script seemed nothing more than a waste of ink. "I spent my whole life trying to please everyone, trying to be the perfect image, the impeccable product, and all I achieved was a life where I don't recognize myself." Clara sighed, a sound of relief and fear mixed. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Julianne stood up, walking to the window, watching the lights of Los Angeles glittering below, an ocean of artificial stars. "I'm saying that maybe fame isn't worth the price. I'm saying that maybe, if I stop running, if I stop hiding, we can finally breathe." She felt her heart beating in her chest, a rhythmic beat, full of promises. "I no longer want to be their star, Clara. I want to be me, and I want you there when that happens." The silence that followed was no longer of fear, but of contained expectation, a suspended moment where both of our destinies were being rewritten. Clara, in her cold apartment in New York, stood up and walked to the window. The snow was falling stronger now, covering the city with a mantle of silence. "You know what this means, right?" she asked, a calmer, more aware voice. "They won't accept this peacefully. They will try in every possible way to stop us. They will speak, manipulate, try to destroy everything we built." Julianne smiled, a small, sad smile, but filled with renewed courage. "Let them destroy. What they have to destroy is a lie. What we have is the only thing that matters." She felt a strange peace, the first in years. The decision was made. There was no turning back, no more safe paths, only the raw truth and the risk of living by it. "I'm going to quit," Clara said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'll take the first flight back." Julianne closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, as if filling her lungs with the air of a newly discovered freedom. "And I'll be waiting for you at the airport." The agreement was made, simple and definitive, sealed not with grand promises, but with the weight of two people who had finally stopped fleeing. The phone was still in hand, but the distance between them, which before had seemed an insurmountable chasm, began to shorten with the simple force of a single choice. They did not know what the future would be, nor what would happen when the dust settled, but for the first time, tomorrow was not a threat, it was a possibility. They had chosen each other, above all expectations, above all conventions, above all the noise the world tried to impose. And in the night's quiet, between the cold of New York and the artificial warmth of Los Angeles, they knew that, finally, they were going home. LAX Terminal seemed a cold, impersonal gear, a place designed for quick passages, not for waits that would define the rest of a life. Julianne was there, hidden under the brim of a cap and dark glasses, hands buried deep in the coat pockets to hide the tremor that refused to pass. Each time an automatic door opened, her heart leaped against her ribs, a physical reaction she could not quiet, no matter how she tried. When Clara finally appeared, carrying a single suitcase and an expression of someone who had just crossed an invisible border, the airport's din seemed to dissolve into a distant buzz. There was no sprint. There was no cinematic embrace. Only the distance diminishing, step by step, until they stood face to face. Clara stopped, shoulders slumped slightly with the weight of the suitcase and accumulated exhaustion, eyes fixed on Julianne's as if searching for any sign of regret. "You came," Clara said, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper that barely competed with the announcement of a departing flight in the background. Julianne simply nodded, unable to articulate any word, reaching out to touch, for the first time in weeks, the nape of Clara's neck, feeling the real warmth, the texture of skin under the chill of the air conditioning. The drive back to Julianne's home was filled with a silence that, for the first time, was not laden with tension, but with a strange and fragile calm. Los Angeles sped past the car window like a film on fast forward, lights and shadows no longer the backdrop of a studio, but merely the path to a place where the mask did not need to be worn. Julianne drove with hands firmly on the wheel, glancing occasionally at Clara, who watched the horizon with a melancholy that was not sadness but detachment. There were no scripts left, no producers calling, no constant fear of being discovered. It was simply a shift, a transition from public life to private, an abyss they had just crossed without looking back. When they parked in the garage, the night silence seemed to envelop the car, a protective cocoon separating them from the rest of the world outside. Clara stepped out, California's night air bringing the scent of jasmine and the ocean breeze, a radical change from the dry cold of New York that had accompanied her in recent days. Inside the house, the soft light of the entry hall revealed the fatigue they both carried, a lasting mark of months living under the pressure of prying eyes. Clara set the suitcase on the floor with a dull thud, the sound echoing in the spacious, modern area that, up to that moment, had seemed more like a set than a home. Julianne watched the motion, how Clara adjusted her hair, the nerves visible in the gestures of someone still waiting to be interrupted by an assistant or an emergency call. "I really quit," Clara murmured, looking at her own hands, as if processing the reality of that act. "Tomorrow, when they realize I'm not there, it will be chaos. They'll call, threaten, want to know why." Julianne walked to her, stopping at a respectful distance, before taking the final step and closing the space. "Let them call," Julianne answered, her voice steady, stripped of the rehearsed cadence of interviews. "Let them ask. We owe them nothing, Clara. For the first time, we owe nothing to anyone." The kitchen was lit only by a soft, indirect light, casting long shadows over the marble counter. Julianne began to brew coffee, a domestic and banal gesture that, in that moment, felt like an act of rebellion. The smell of roasted coffee started to fill the space, overpowering the scent of paper and stress Clara had brought with her. Clara leaned against the opposite wall, watching Julianne's routine with a quiet intensity, as if learning to read that version of her, a version that didn't need professional lighting or wardrobe to be real. "Don't you feel afraid?" Clara asked, her dark eyes tracking Julianne's movements as she picked up 2 ceramic cups. "Fear that all this is just a dream that will end when the sun rises and the phone rings?" Julianne paused for a second, the hand suspended in the air. Fear was there, a shadow in the corner of the room, but it was not greater than the peace she felt seeing Clara there, finally, in her space. "I feel afraid every day," Julianne replied, turning to hand the steaming cup to Clara. Their fingers brushed, a contact that sparked immediately, the kind of connection no script could ever replicate. "But it's a different fear now. Before, I was afraid I wouldn't be able to be what they wanted. Now, I'm afraid that the time we lost hiding won't be enough to make up for what lies ahead." Clara held the cup, the heat of the vessel warming her cold hands. She looked at Julianne, and for the first time there was no darting glance, no protection. There was only an act, raw and vulnerable. The silence that settled in wasn't tense. It was the breath of 2 people who, after an exhausting marathon, could finally stop and feel their own hearts beating in their chests, unpaced by others' rhythms. They sat on the balcony, where the night of Los Angeles stretched out like a map of possibilities ahead of them. The distant city noise was just background hum, unable to invade that improvised sanctuary. There was no longer a need to talk about what had happened, the broken contracts, or the careers left behind. All that mattered was that, in the middle of all that machinery, they had found each other. Clara, who had always been the voice of reason and logistics, relaxed her shoulders, letting the night wrap around her. Julianne, who had always been the object of desire and the image to be sold, felt finally seen. It was a role reversal that didn't ask for explanations. "What are we going to do tomorrow?" Clara asked, a small and uncertain smile playing on her lips. "I have no idea," Julianne admitted, softly laughing, a sound that seemed strangely new in that place. "I think, for the first time in years, we have the freedom not to have a schedule." The night advanced, and fatigue began giving way to a deep calm. They didn't make promises of an idealized future. They knew challenges would come, that the transition would be hard, and that the world outside wouldn't be kind to the choice they had made. But the commitment to be there, to be present for one another, was the only anchor needed. Julianne watched Clara's profile under the artificial city lights, recalling every moment she had to pretend not to see her, every time she had to swallow desire to maintain appearances. That was over. The lie had an expiration date, and it had expired that night. Clara, in turn, felt the pressure in her chest ease, that constant stiffness that kept her from breathing deeply, now replaced by a lightness that seemed frightening, but necessary. The sun would begin to rise in a few hours, bringing daylight, the scrutiny of the world, and the reality of consequences. But for now, there was only that moment. Clara set the empty cup on the glass table with a soft sound. She moved closer to Julianne, no longer as the professional manager, no longer as the shadow, but as someone who could finally assume the place that had always belonged to her. Julianne did not flinch. She leaned in, closing the gap that had kept them apart for so long. There were no words, no grand promises. Only the night's silence, the distant city sound, and the certainty that, regardless of what happened when the clock struck the start of a new day, they would no longer face the world alone. Clara touched Julianne's face, a slow, nearly hesitant movement, as if mapping each feature, every detail she had been forced to overlook. Julianne closed her eyes, surrendering to the touch, feeling Clara's fingertips drawing a gentle line along her jaw. It was a small, imperfect gesture, lacking the grandeur of a film, but filled with an honesty no lens could capture. And when Julianne finally opened her eyes, she saw Clara there, present, real, with nothing else to hide or protect. The shared silence was dense, comfortable, the kind of silence that only exists when words become superfluous, and another person's presence is all that's needed. Tomorrow would be a new day, with new challenges, new fears, and new uncertainties. But there, in that suspended moment, the future didn't matter. What mattered was that, after so long, one breath was finally synchronized with the others, and the rest was only the detail of a life that, for the first time, they could call their own. And so, without saying anything, Julianne took Clara's hand, and intertwined it with hers, squeezing it with a firmness that said everything. They stayed there, watching the sky begin to brighten, waiting for the first ray of sun that would illuminate, not a film set, but the silent truth that, no matter what the world thought, they finally had the right to begin. Clara rested her head on Julianne's shoulder, releasing a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of an entire life of restraint. And Julianne simply held her hand, keeping it there, in the dark that slowly turned into dawn, ready for whatever the silence of the following day might bring. Perhaps tomorrow the world outside would find them, perhaps not. But for now, they were there, together, just two people on a balcony, waiting for the day to rise, without script, without lines, and for the first time, without fear of being seen.